It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 chief ministers over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the chief ministers and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the chief ministers and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these chief ministers and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal ministers, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it into writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sunset to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the ring of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Well, let's spend some time thinking about that chapter, and then we'll sing and then eat together, and then we'll reflect on its application for us after we've eaten. It's always difficult, isn't it, with familiar stories. We kind of know what's coming and we can easily switch off, but let's just pay careful attention to the chapter and see what we can learn. And first thing I'd like you to notice in verses 1 to 3 is the king's plan. Darius is new to the throne. You'll see that in verse 31. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. 31 of chapter 5. Belshazzar's Babylonian empire has been overthrown, and Darius has come to the throne. Now, there's a bit of a muddle over who Darius is, and there's lots of ideas. Anti-biblical scholars will tell you that because there is no Darius, therefore this is a fictional story. The reality is they also said that about Belshazzar, and then lo and behold, he turned up. So there's no reason to disbelieve the Bible on an argument of silence. I'm the most convincing answer I've come across is that Darius is the Median name of Cyrus. And lots of governors in those days, depending on where they were operating, had a different name. And these names are often titles. So like Pharaoh, that wasn't his name, that was his title. Darius and Cyrus, and you'll get Darius the first and Darius the second and so on. And actually, if you look down in the story to the end of the chapter, where it says, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, you can see in the footnote in the NIV, or Darius, that is the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So it's quite possible that this Darius is Cyrus himself, and I think that's the easiest explanation. He's just come to the throne. The Median Persian Empire has just arisen, overthrown the Babylonians, and the king's plan then is to secure the organization of the kingdom. And so he appoints 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. It is a massive kingdom. It's a huge geographic area, and he's just come to be seated on the throne, and the first job is to secure the administration, to make sure everything is going to work. We've seen the reversing process this week, haven't we, in the UK, with the falling apart of the administration and the resignation of the key posts. Darius is doing exactly the opposite. He's getting the right people in the right places to rule the kingdom. Notice why he's putting these 120 satraps in verse 2. It's so that he might not suffer loss. The 120 are accountable to 3 who oversee them, 3 chief ministers, verse 2. And the reason for that is to make sure the king doesn't suffer loss. With a team of 120 scattered through the kingdom, it's quite easy for one of them to be fomenting rebellion against the king or fiddling the taxes. So they're getting very wealthy and it's not coming through to the king, so he could administer the whole empire. And so of the 120, there are 3 chief ministers to be over those and to make sure they behave themselves. And in that administrative description, which doesn't sound particularly exciting, we are told, can you see in verse 2, that Daniel is one of the 3 chief ministers. He was the forgotten man a few months ago during Belshazzar's reign, but as Cyrus comes to the throne, he's one of those 3 chief ministers. And we read in verse 3 that of those 3, he distinguished himself by his exceptional qualities. Daniel stood out over all the others. He's probably now in his 80s. He stood out as a young man when the examination had come for the civil service. And throughout his whole life then, he has stood out. And in his later life, he's still standing out with exceptional qualities. And because of that, the king trusts him to be over the 3. He's going to be number 2 in the kingdom. He's going to be administrating the 3 who administrate the 120 who administrate the whole empire. And actually, that's a very good and wise plan, isn't it? It's a very sensible project that the king has put into place to control the empire. He's appointed his government, he's appointed his inner cabinet, and he's got his right-hand man who is exceptional, trustworthy, reliable. So that's the king's plan, verses 1 to 3. Now look at the jealous plot, verses 4 to 18. It is that act of actually setting up the government and the exceptional qualities of Daniel that kicks into gear the rest of the chapter. Can you see in verse 4, at this, the chief ministers and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel. Soon as this new government is put in place, there is jealousy, rivalry, fighting for permission, jostling, hatred of the man in the number 2 seat. It's human nature, isn't it? We're going to see a lot of that in the coming weeks as people club together to get enough votes to get through the next round of the Tory party leadership campaign. And then they'll be ditching some and following others, and it's all shuffling, all looking to protect their position. Sorry, I don't mean to slate all politicians, but let's face it, when it comes to power, people start playing these games. And as soon as the king has set up his new administration, which seems very wise, 120, 3, 1, the 1 is the source of jealousy, and the 3 and the 120 want to get rid of him, but they've got a problem. Can you see in verse 4? There is nothing in his civil service conduct to disqualify him. There is no dodgy interview. There is no brown envelope. There is no rumor. There's nothing. They can't find anything. Can you see verse 4? There's no corruption in him because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Corruption is a wicked thing. Negligent is a capability thing. There are some things you can miss. It's not necessarily purposeful. You just can't cope with everything. But Daniel's on top of it all. He's godly and he's competent. And so there's nothing in his civil service record that they can pin on him. And they recognize in verse 5 that the only way they're going to get Daniel is in connection with his religion, unless it's something to do with the law of his God. And so motivated then by spite, by jealousy, by not having the power they want, these men plot to get rid of Daniel. It's interesting, I just noticed on the BBC News website, Sajid Javid this morning on the TV programme was being interviewed about his resignation, and he said he heard a sermon at a prayer breakfast by Les Isaacs, the founder of Street Pastors, on the importance of integrity in service. And he heard that sermon, and he went home and drafted his resignation letter, and then resigned from government. Isn't that interesting? He recognized the importance of integrity. And Daniel did, and these guys can't shift him. He is a man of integrity. He is trustworthy. And that leaves us with a very obvious application question, doesn't it? Is that us? Is that us as we live our lives? We might not be number 2 in the kingdom. I'm very grateful I'm not number 2 in the cabinet. But are we trustworthy? Are there things that people could pin on us because of the way we've behaved? It's a challenging question, isn't it? And Daniel stands out because of that. So, on this plot, they can't shift him because of corruption or anything like that. So they've got to cook up a way of dealing with Daniel on the basis of his religion. And so they go to King Darius and they come up with this brilliant idea of persuading Darius that no one is able to pray to any other god or human being for the next 30 days. I'm not convinced that they're saying that they've got to pray to Darius alone. It seems to be that he's the kind of key mediator, chief priest, rather than the deity. Does that make sense? It wasn't typical of Babylonian or Persian kings to claim deity, but this idea that He was the chief priest. He was the conduit through whom all prayers to any other gods had to go. And to Darius's ears, I suspect that sounded like a really good idea, because he's trying to secure the kingdom. He's trying to unite everybody. He's trying to get this new administration in place. And so, yes, I am the king, so that makes sense. Make me the mediator to any of the gods, and so everybody's got to pray through me to their gods. That sounds like a great idea. And so the law is enacted. And you might remember from the book of Esther that repeated phrase about the law of the Medes and Persians that can't be undone. So what's Daniel going to do? He can only pray to his God through Darius, Cyrus, or can only pray to Darius, Cyrus, whichever interpretation you take. What's Daniel going to do? Well, the verses are quite blunt, aren't they? When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, verse 10, he went up home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. There's no change in routine for Daniel. Nothing shifts. Now it's interesting, isn't it? If you think back to chapter 3, in contrast with chapter 6, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fiery furnace, they were being asked to do something wrong, bow to the idol. Daniel is being told he can't do something right, pray. But whichever the pressure is, Daniel's not going to disobey. And so he goes home and does what he's always done. It's not that the law makes him do something more. He just carries on his routine. And he's not hiding his prayer. He's not thinking, well, I've been told I can't pray, but I want to pray, so I'm going to go and hide away. I think we need to be careful, though, that we don't think he's flaunting it either. He's not going to the town square and praying and attracting trouble. He's going to the little room on top of his flat roof, which was a private place for those of wealth, where they could get away from the crowds and sit in the cool air at the day. And so he's opened the windows on that building on the roof to pray towards Jerusalem. The guys who find him have to go looking for him. So he's not deliberately sticking 2 fingers up at the government and going and standing in the middle of the town square and saying, I'm doing this. He's just carry on with his normal routine, neither hiding it nor flaunting it. Now, why is he praying towards Jerusalem? I remember going out to the Philippines on Gulf Air and loved watching the map of where we were. That was quite fascinating. But in the corner of the map always was a pointer to where Mecca was, so that those who are of the Islamic faith could bow in the right place, the right direction when it came to prayer. We're not doing that, so why is Daniel praying towards Jerusalem? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon opened the temple, and as they celebrated God's Spirit filling the temple, Solomon asked in his prayer of dedication that when things went wrong for people, that they could look to the temple and pray towards this place and know God's forgiveness and the assurance of his prayers. The temple was their place of mediation. It was the place where God was present, where sacrifices were made, where relationship was restored, and so they were encouraged to pray towards the temple. So Daniel, as he gets his government house in Babylon, makes sure that the windows face towards Jerusalem so he can pray on the basis of that prayer. And Daniel's act here, in some ways, is more revolutionary than an all-out rebellion. Rebellion says, that's the number 1 seat of authority, Darius' throne, and I want to take it off him. Daniel says, your throne is not the number 1 seat of authority, and so I'm ignoring it. I'm going to a higher power. I'm going to pray to my God. Prayer denies the ultimacy altogether of this throne and acknowledges a higher power. And notice that there are 2 components of Daniel's prayer that are picked up here in these verses. Can you see in verse 10? He got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he'd done before. So law's just been made. Anyone who doesn't pray to the king is going to be thrown into a den of lions. And Daniel goes home and gives thanks. But also then we see when the other guys come spying on him in verse 11, they see him asking God for help. Paul in Philippians 4 verse 6 writes, don't be anxious for anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Here's the content of our prayer. Thankfulness, petition, asking for help. So here is Daniel. The law's been made, and he just gets on with what he's always done. And I've heard many sermons which ask the question, if the law was made today, would it make any difference to our normal practice? That's challenging, isn't it? It's challenging. If we were told we're not allowed to pray, would we stop? So, Daniel is caught, he's reported, watching the time, and it's told to Darius. And Darius' response is very interesting, isn't it? Do you remember in the story of the fiery furnace when the news came to Nebuchadnezzar that 3 Jews had not bowed before the statue when the music had played? He was furious, mad, full of rage. Darius is distressed, troubled. Nebuchadnezzar's attitude was, how dare they not follow my command? Darius' attitude was, oh Daniel, what have I done? Here's the man he trusts. He realizes now that he's been caught out by these jealous minor officials, and his hands are tied. He's got to throw him into the den of lions. But what does he say as he does it in verse 16? May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Darius doesn't have personal faith, it's your God. But he recognizes that this is the God that Daniel serves continuously. And notice that phrase then, as we move into the final section, verses 19 and onwards, and we see the divine rescue, king's plan, jealous plot, divine rescue, that actually Darius comes again to Daniel in the morning, having thrown him into the lion's den. And what's his line? Can you see that in verse 20? Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? What is Darius drawing our attention to? What is the one thing that's repeated in the whole chapter? What is it that is supposed to grab our attention here? It's that Daniel lives a holy life all the time. He's continually faithful. He prays 3 times a day, every day. He prays towards the temple because that's the source of their hope every day. And so when the command comes, he doesn't waver. He doesn't start praying. He just carries on praying. He serves the living God continually. That's the focus in this chapter. It's repeated twice. It's emphasizing us. Emphasizing for us. And poor old Darius, who's the one who's commending Daniel for this, the one thing that stands out about Daniel in this chapter is his consistent living. And the beauty of this story is that Darius has had a really bad night's sleep in his royal bedroom. And Daniel's had a great night in the lion's den. The angel has been sent to stop the mouths of the lions. Daniel is utterly fine, verses 21 and 22. Darius hasn't slept a wink for worry for Daniel. And Daniel is able to say, God has sent his angel. They've not hurt me. I was found innocent in his sight. You sent me for this punishment. The punishment has not happened because I don't deserve it. And then the narrator backs that up by saying that Daniel was unharmed because he trusted in his God. There is this combination then of innocence and trust, the source of Daniel's rescue. The means was an angel. The reason is this innocence and trust. And as the king then is relieved that Daniel is safe, in a sense he's passed the punishment. He's been in the lion's den, he survived. The king then commands that all those who accuse Daniel face the penalty that they've tried to get him into, and they're thrown in. And for those who don't believe that the first bit was a miracle, oh well, the lions were fat, they were well fed, that's why they didn't harm Daniel, that's why he survived. Well then, if that's not a miracle, the next bit is, because they eat this lot. These are not tame lions, these are hungry, vicious lions. And these folks meet with God's judgment. And then we find at the end of the story concludes with Darius again, Darius praising God as the living God, verses 26 and 27, the God whose kingdom endures, whose kingdom will not be destroyed, whose dominion will never end. And it sounds like Belshazzar, and it sounds like Nebuchadnezzar, and it sounds like Nebuchadnezzar on the first run. And you're thinking, bit of a repeated lesson here. An acknowledgement of the most powerful man on the planet, that actually is God's kingdom that lasts and isn't destroyed. And verse 28 just captures that for us as we read that Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, which is the reign of Cyrus the Persian, just in the way that he prospered through Nebuchadnezzar's reign and Belshazzar's. It didn't matter which earthly king was on the throne, because Daniel's God was always on the throne. It didn't matter which culture was ruling, whether it was the Babylonian or whether it was the Persian, because Daniel's God was ruling. And that's why in Daniel chapters 1 to 6, we have 6 stories, all with the same lesson for us. Doesn't matter which day of the week, doesn't matter which king, doesn't matter which country, doesn't matter which latest fad, doesn't matter which pressure point, God's on the throne. And we can trust him through all of that. And as we spill into the rest of the story, the rest of Daniel is also written to give us this assurance that we can live faithfully, we can live consistent godly lives through challenge because God is in control. Chapters 1 to 6 are the easy bit to encourage us. Chapters 7 onwards are a little bit more challenging, but I'm not skipping them. We'll come back, God willing, to those in the autumn to delight in the interesting prophecies of Daniel 7 to the end.